Hello and welcome back to my channel. Within the world that is adoption and the world that is foster care, infants and young children are expected to make sense of emotions and experiences that most adults would not be able to cope with. Think about it. You are a tiny human being and you have been removed from your parents, siblings, your home, your community, your culture, your country. You have experienced the loss of identity, the loss of innocence, the loss of hope, the loss of home. And on top of that, you are expected to just make it work. No matter what you feel, you have to make it work in a family system that doesn't understand. You are expected to behave like any other child, ignoring the fact you are carrying the weight of the world on your tiny shoulders. The reality created leaves some children growing up overwhelmed with emotions that they have no way of processing or understanding. This beginning, this start to life, these first few years, they shape the way we see and interpret the world around us. Removal trauma leaves its mark, no matter how good or bad the childhood is. Adoption and foster care changes the way a child develops, experiences, expresses, and interprets emotions, shaping in their tiny mind what is right and what is wrong, what is safe and what isn't, as well as the reality that is sought in a way that is far more embedded than most will ever realize. Strong emotions consume you. Within a young, tiny mind, they shape everything you are and what you will become, regardless of how the world likes to demand the outcome it wants. Very rarely is this ever the case, and we are left to make sense of the impossible.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening all, it's Bear here. And I'd like to welcome you to my YouTube channel, A Box With No Lid. A channel I'm creating not just to bring the awareness around the lived reality of complex trauma, removal trauma, the world that is adoption and the world that is foster care, but I'm really trying to bring forward what I've learned through my own experiences and my own journey, as well as what I've learned over many years of being a practitioner and an advocate, all with a simple hope that something you may learn or hear here will help improve the quality of your life and maybe help fill in some of the gaps or put some of the pieces of the puzzle into place so that you can make the changes you wish to give yourself the life you deserve, to create the life you deserve. Now, yes, this is the next video on the adoption series, and as you can see by the claymation, I'm still circling around the understandings that are needed around the sheer amount of emotion that is placed through experiences within an infant or a very, very young child that they are expected to handle and process with little or no consideration to that process. In the world that is adoption and the world that is foster care, this is the case. If you place this amount of experiential upheaval on an adult, there is an entire industry there to access if you can afford it. But there is an entire industry which shows society recognizes just how much is entailed in the uprooting of a person and removing them from family and placing them somewhere else, sometimes in another country. And in the world that is adoption and foster care, there is none. Now, I spent years being involved in Senate inquiries and state and federal apologies and investigations and panels and everything over here in Australia where I grew up. And there was never the recognition, other than, meaningless platitudes by, bureaucrats and people within the mental health profession. But there was never any sincere acknowledgement of what the outcome is, the reality that that tiny little infant, that tiny little child, that tiny little person, what we were supposed to do. And I want to make a few more videos around some of the pathways that this plays out within the world of adoption. The world of foster care adds other layers where you have multiple placements. In the world that is foster care, you also have a lot more institutionalization. You have a lot more gaps between placements. And there's all these so-called solutions that create such a destabilizing process for the majority of children that go through the system. Very few end up with a very successful first long-term placement. Maybe it's even on the path to being adopted. In the world that is adoption, immediately upon placement, that child is expected to fulfill a parental void, the people choosing to adopt that child. And that child has a whole complex jar of emotion, from the turmoil of removal and the process of separation and everything that happened between the point of removal or leading up to removal and that moment right there of being placed within an adoptive family. Not the next video, but the video after, I'll go into some of the things that creates and the difficulties and the outcomes and the reasons why so many adoptions fail lie within that. In this video, I want to focus on just the acknowledgement of the level of emotion and some of the pathways it can go. One of the reasons why it is not acknowledged in a lot of the mental health fields in any serious way is because, one, there's huge challenges to work with it, but two, there are so many varied pathways. When you look at how many adoptees there are and how many varied interpretations of life and what the adoptees have become and their views of adoption, there is no single it leads to this specific point. It leads to many, and there are many reasons behind it, and they're not as complicated when you understand them. When you look at a tiny person, a young infant or a very young child, there is not a lot of options available within that child to even categorize what is happening, to even understand what is going on. And the body has certain mechanisms in place to do that. We are protected from trauma. We dorsal vagal, we shut down, we freeze. The nervous system still records all of that, but there is no rational pathway of understanding or interpretation, even using like regressional therapies when you're older, because the brain hasn't put cognitive timestamps to each experience to help make sense of it, to be able to process. It's just a pile of upheaval and emotion. The other component that the body draws upon is epigenetics. And that's the next video I want to go into a little bit more, because it's really the only processing option available. The higher functions of the brain, our cognitive parts, do not develop post 12 months of age. So if you're a removal at birth, the first 12 months you've got an underdeveloped higher brain function trying to speed develop to create a way to process or interpret what is going on, enough to ensure survival, enough to try to make sense of survival. How am I going to survive? I've spoken about it in more technical terms in other videos on my channel. But in this one, just hold with that you have a mind without the capacity to make sense of it, to step it out and go, well, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening, this is happening. It is all just one chaotic mess. It overloads, so the body's threat response kicks in, dorsal vagal shutdown, dissociation. That gap and that separation, when the child is expected or is required or starts to form a connection with the adoption, the placement household, the adoption household, there's that ball, that jar of emotion, that jar of adrenaline, that jar of all our threat responses, physiologically and cognitively. All of that has to get put to one side, because the child needs to focus, or is expected to focus, on forming a bond to survive with the adopted parents. You know, it's like the person, if you're in a life raft floating out at sea and a boat turns up, you don't care who's in the boat. You just want them to pick you up and take you out. And that desperation often gets misconstrued as a deep connection to the adopted parents, a desire to be with them, a desire to be part of them. And again, not the next video, but the video after, I'll explain a little more into some of the pitfalls that come out of that. But there's a whole bunch of misunderstanding and misinterpretation around this entire huge ball of knotted emotions and experiences without a time frame, without a timeline. The body hasn't got the capacity to develop a timeline. And that is why we see in the world of adoption so many cases of complex post-traumatic stress disorder. One of the fundamental structures around CPTSD is the inability for the body to create a timeline that even can be accessed through therapy, so that the body can put the sequence of events into a timeline to process. And that is where one of the major difficulty lies in working with this stuff from a therapeutic standpoint. You're working with a mind that hasn't fully developed and has had its development fundamentally altered by the experiences. And that takes work. Now, if we look at adoptions that are successful, the ones that have had a more positive outcome, what has resolved it is a childhood where the adoptive parents recognize they're raising somebody else's child and they form a bond around that. They work with the child of integrating them into their family by learning the child, not expecting the child to learn them. And that is one of the fundamental differences I've noticed over the decades of speaking with adoptees who are perfectly fine with their adoption and asking them, well, how was your childhood? What was your experiences and your interpretation of your experiences, and relating them to the differences between the experiences of the adoptees whose adoptions failed. And you can clearly see that if the adoptive parents took the time to learn the child they were looking after because that child was not biologically theirs, the adoptions worked. But if the adoptive parents expected that child to fit into their reality, their requirements, and to learn them, the adoptions didn't. I really hope you guys understand where I'm coming from. As I said, in the next couple of videos, I'm going to go into other parts of this process. This is a huge process. I could talk for hours around all the variations within this. So I'm going to make a set number of videos that I have to step out in the hope that I can do this explanation justice. As always, I love you guys' comments and feedback. Please smash the like button and subscribe. Support the channel as best you can. Just by, giving the acknowledgement, hitting that like button, hitting the share button, sending these videos to those you think they may be helpful to. But as always, I love you guys' comments and feedback. Please be mindful, please be safe, and I will see you all next time.